lectures on the governing principles of ancient China, the harm of extravagance. On the 22nd of January 2013, at the second plenary meeting of the 18th Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, General Secretary Xi Jinping quoted two verses by the Tang Dynasty poet Li Xiangyan. Through reviewing the past sages, families and nations, one can find out that success comes from diligence and thrift, while failure is due to extravagance. By quoting it, he encouraged all party members and all Chinese people to call for a nationwide campaign against the common practice of extravagance. Professor Yuli Liu from the Department of Philosophy at the Party School of the Central Committee of the CPC is going to provide historical examples that success comes from thrift, while failure is due to extravagance, and show us, especially leaders at all levels, that extravagance can not only cause instant misfortune to oneself, but also can ruin a family or even a nation. Here are the lectures on the governing principles of ancient China, the harm of extravagance. Professor Yuli Liu graduated with a bachelor's and master's degree in philosophy from Renmin University of China. She is currently a professor at the Department of Philosophy at the Party School of Central Committee of CPC and a mentor for doctoral students majoring in ethics. She is also a visiting professor at Tsinghua College, Sun Yat-sen University. Professor Yuli Liu has published many academic papers, received a PhD from the University of Hull, UK, and is a postdoctoral scholar at the National University of Singapore. She has been invited to give lectures and participate in workshop seminars in the UK, Italy, the USA, Canada, Australia, Japan, Singapore and Indonesia. In 2015, 2016 and 2017, she was invited to UNESCO headquarters in Paris to give talks based on the governing principles of ancient China. The central theme of her talks was the importance of the sage's education. In other words, learning from the wisdom of the past and also how to promote moral education. She has contributed greatly towards the dissemination of Oriental culture in the Western world. This video was edited by the Governing Principles of Ancient China translation team of the Pure Land Learning College Association and is based on the lectures by Professor Yuli Liu.
Dear friends, greetings to you all. Today we continue our study of the governing principles of ancient China. Today's topic is titled The Harm of Extravagance. In the Book of Han, compiled in the Governing Principles of Ancient China, it says, almost 1,000 years have passed since the golden age of King Chun and King Kang of the Zhou dynasty. Since then, many rulers have tried to attain the same glory, but this golden era of peace and prosperity has never been duplicated. Why not? According to historical records, during the golden age of King Chun and King Kang of the Zhou dynasty, the lawful punishments had not been used for 40 years and the prisons were empty because there were no criminals. It was a great achievement of good governance. In the Book of Han, a very good question is asked. Why has such a golden era not occurred since then? The book says it's because rulers have forsaken the principles of proprieties. The principles of proprieties can be summarised in the 5 relationships: 5 constant virtues, 4 anchors, and 8 virtues. The 5 relationships refer to the loving relationship between parent and child, loyalty and fairness between leader and subordinate, distinct responsibilities between husband and wife, proper order between senior and junior, and trust between friends. The 5 constant virtues are benevolence, honour, propriety, wisdom, and trustworthiness. The 4 anchors are propriety, honour, integrity, and shame. The 8 virtues are loyalty, loving and honouring parents, benevolence, love, trustworthiness, righteousness, harmony and peace. All these are the principles of proprieties, which are timeless principles for governing a country. Unfortunately, changes to rules and laws in more recent times didn't always apply these principles, and instead, those in government chose to rule with a selfish heart and favouritism. This is the first reason why a golden era, like the golden age of King Cheng and King Kang of the Zhou dynasty, had not happened in China again until the Han dynasty. Second, the Book of Han says, extravagance prevailed while benevolence and righteousness were abandoned. Why were subsequent rulers extravagant? Because they failed to control their desires and instead allowed them to grow. Therefore, the rulers inevitably started living an extravagant and wasteful life. Once rulers start being extravagant and wasteful, they tend to exploit people at all costs and lose their benevolent and loving heart towards their own people. Consequently, as the history books show us, extravagance prevailed while benevolence and righteousness were abandoned. This is the key reason why China was unable to return to its former flourishing age of peace and prosperity. These 2 sentences from the governing principles of ancient China can be proven through events in history. There were many flourishing ages throughout China's 5,000-year history. By studying them thoroughly, we can find that, without exception, they were all due to rulers advocating thrift and fighting extravagance. We know that Emperor Tai Zhang of Tang created the era of great government of Jin-guan. How did he strictly advocate thrift and fight extravagance? Based on the records in the chapter titled The Discussion on Thrift in The Essentials of Governance in the Jin-guan Reign, Emperor Tai Zhang said to his courtiers in the first year of Jin-guan period, "From ancient times until now, all rulers must follow their people's hearts if they want to engage in a big project. For example, in the past, King Yu had mountains cut into and new waterways created, which required a massive amount of manpower. Surprisingly, no one complained. Why not? Because he did what the people wanted, and so reflected their wishes. But when Ying Zhi, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, was having his palace built, the people rose against him. Why? Because his project went against the people's hearts and was only intended to fulfill his selfish desires. Now I want to build a palace and I have all the timbers and materials ready. However, thinking of Ying Zhi's experience of failure, I have decided not to build it." This decision made by Emperor Tai Zhang of the Tang dynasty is similar to an example described in the Book of History compiled in the Governing Principles of Ancient China. Do not do non-beneficial deeds that will harm beneficial deeds. Also, the Tao Te Ching of the Governing Principles of Ancient China says, not to show people what is likely to excite their desires is the way to keep their minds from disorder. Therefore, Emperor Tai Zhang ordered that all officials lower than kings and dukes were forbidden from excessive spending and extravagance in terms of residences, carts, clothing, weddings, funerals, and so on. Consequently, 20 years later, the social atmosphere became one that valued simplicity and frugality, while the country became materially rich. During that time, no one in the country suffered from cold or hunger. In the second year of the Jin-guan period, a high-ranking official reported to Emperor Tai Zhang. According to the Book of Rites, during the last month of summer, the emperor should live in a high-set palace, instead of the current one, which is low and damp. Since the hot days have not yet passed and the continuous heavy rains of autumn have just started, Your Majesty should have a building constructed for your residence." How did Emperor Taizong reply? He said, "I suffer from diseases and should avoid low and damp places. However, if I were to accept your request, there would be a huge expense." Today's situation makes me think of Emperor Wen of the Han dynasty. Emperor Wen of Han wanted to build a gazebo, but found that the cost would be equal to the living expenses of 10 average households. After some consideration, he abandoned the idea. "As my virtue does not exceed Emperor Wen of Han's, how can I let my consumption exceed his?" An emperor should look after his people like parents caring for their children. Is approving this building project the way of an emperor as a parent of the people? Therefore, although high-ranking officials repeatedly reported this matter to Emperor Taizong, he never approved it. From this quotation, we can see that, through studying the governing principles of ancient China, Emperor Taizong indeed applied the teachings to the way he governed. He knew that he must control his desires and not compromise the people's interests to satisfy himself. It was by doing so that he created the era of great government of Zhenguan. His conduct is exactly what is said in Lao Tzu, compiled in the governing principles of ancient China. If I do not have desires, then the people will naturally become simple and honest. That is, if leaders, especially like presidents or prime ministers, do not have excessive desires, the atmosphere of society will naturally return to simplicity and honesty. After learning of the examples set by ancient rulers who strictly advocated thriftiness, let's now look at whether modern leaders can govern by using these same teachings found in the governing principles of ancient China. We know nowadays that China is fighting extravagance. Why? Because the leaders of China are acutely aware of the harm of extravagance. In the Book of Rights, which is compiled in the governing principles of ancient China, it is said, if extravagance prevails in a country, then the people should be taught to value thrift and learn how to be thrifty. But if the country is too thrifty, then the people should learn about propriety. Propriety should not be excessive or insufficient. Being overly thrifty and miserly is also inappropriate. For example, when important guests visit us, we should treat them according to the rules of propriety. If we are too thrifty, guests may feel uncomfortable. Being too thrifty is sometimes inappropriate. Everything we do should be in moderation. The current situation in China is one of extravagance. Therefore, we need to advocate thrift. That's why, after his inauguration, General Secretary Xi Jinping proposed the central government's 8 rules, which targeted leaders' conduct in relation to corruption and extravagance. Moreover, he also set himself as a role model of thrift in order to teach the public not to make lifestyle comparisons with each other. Since the leader has provided a good example, his practice of fighting against extravagance spread across China very quickly. Why shouldn't we compare our enjoyment with others and live an extravagant and wasteful life? Our ancestors said, recklessly wasting natural resources will definitely incur heaven's punishment. Inappropriately consuming public wealth will definitely incur public grudges. Indulging in desires and breaking the law will quickly bring misfortune and disaster. Therefore, any leader, no matter an ancient emperor or a modern national leader, must understand the huge cost of living extravagantly and advocate thrift to guide the public into eliminating comparisons, extravagance, wastefulness, and so on. In the next part, we will look at examples of how extravagance can lead to disaster.
Using the questions and answers regarding the creation of a harmonious and flourishing age as found in the Book of Han in the Governing Principles of Ancient China, Professor Yuli Liu confirmed an important truth that success comes from thrift while failure is due to extravagance. In the classics such as Lao Tzu, the Book of Rites and the Book of Han, and the discussion on thrift in the Essentials of Governance in the Jingguan reign, it is recorded that the creation of flourishing ages are found throughout various dynasties, including the Golden Age of King Qin and King Kang of the Zhou dynasty, the Golden Age of Emperor Wan and Emperor Qing of the Han dynasty, and the era of great government of Zhen Huan of the Tang dynasty. All of these golden ages were achieved by government leaders advocating diligence, thrift, and moral teachings. However, if a ruler lives extravagantly and the government officials like comparing their lifestyles, extravagance will prevail in the whole society while benevolence and righteousness will be abandoned. As a result, misfortune and disaster will not be far away for the country. Professor Liu pointed out that Chinese government leaders know this through studying the governing principles of ancient China and provide people with excellent examples to lead the whole country to fight against extravagance. Let us continue with the lectures on the governing principles of ancient China, the harm of extravagance.
In the previous part, we talked about extravagant living and how it can cause misfortune. Now let's have a look at some true cases in history. In the Ming Dynasty, there was a very rich person called Zhang Muzhe who owned a lot of assets. Why was he so rich? Because his family provided great contributions to the country in every generation. This is exactly what is said in the Book of Changes. The family which is consistently doing kind deeds will have abundant blessings, overflowing onto their descendants. This is the reason Mr. Zhang owned countless assets. However, he did not study the teachings of the sages and saints. Consequently, Mr. Zhang lived an extremely extravagant and indulgent life. So much so that not even kings or dukes could compete with him. What was the degree of his extravagance? His residence had nearly an acre of beautiful gardens named Scenery Gathering. In the spring, when peony flowers started blooming, he used colourful silk to shade the gardens. Then he had more than 100 ladies sing, dance and drink with him and his guests. He named it 100 Flowers in One Spring Party. After each song, 2 bolts of silken cloth were given as rewards to the performers. We should know that during this time, 400 or 500 years ago, in the Ming Dynasty, 1 bolt of silk was very expensive. So this was a very extravagant reward. When seeing this, one of his guests felt it was too extravagant and said to him, previously, Mr. Ko Zhuan, the Prime Minister of the Song Dynasty, gave 1 bolt of silk as rewards for each song. The extravagance is still criticised by scholars. Your official rank is lower than that of Mr. Ko, so how can your expenses exceed his? Upon hearing this, Zhang laughed loudly and said, Ko Zhuan was such a poor and stingy man. How can you compare me with him? Zhang ignored the advice and continued his extravagance. In the winter, he requested colourful silk to be trimmed into flowers and hung on tree branches. When the silk flowers became old, he replaced them with new ones. Thus, the cost of having annual colourful silk fabric was incalculable. However, there was a final consequence to this behaviour. Only a few years later, he died. Why did Zhang die after only a few years of extravagance? Does his death really have anything to do with his extravagance? Chinese people have a saying, "One dies when one has consumed all of one's destined good fortune." What does this mean? It means that our good fortune in this life is limited. The amount of food that we are entitled to eat in this life is fixed. The expenses that we are entitled to use in this life are also fixed. Once the limit is reached, our lives will end. This is called one dies when one has consumed all of one's destined good fortune. Therefore, due to his few years of extravagance, Zhang had spent all of his destined good fortune in such a short time instead of throughout the rest of his life. Once his destined good fortune ran out, his life was over. There are many similar examples of real people like Zhang throughout Chinese history. Let's have a look at another example, this time Mr. Cai Jing, a Prime Minister during the North Song dynasty. When holding this position, he was extremely extravagant. He used human milk to feed pigs, sesame seeds to feed geese and ducks, and mung beans to feed cows and sheep. He also often used pearls and other treasures to make soup. After boiling a few times, all the pearls and treasures would be thrown away. Every time he invited guests to dinner, a single dish was worth more than all the possessions of a middle-class household. So you can imagine how extravagant he was. However, Cai Jing still thought that the food was not good enough and there was nothing to eat. Zhai Tian, the head of the family servants, knew Cai Jing well and always tried to help him to be even more extravagant. On one occasion, Cai Jing invited around 500 guests to dinner. After the chef served their soup, one of the guests casually commented that duck tongue soup was both delicious and nourishing. Consequently, Zhai Tian looked around and gave a slight nod to his servants, who immediately understood what he wanted. A short time later, every guest was served another bowl of duck tongue soup. But now there were 3 duck tongues in each bowl. Upon seeing this, the guests were astonished. A friend of Zhai Tian jokingly said, "This is not enough. Can you add some more?" Zhai Tian immediately answered, "Since we have the responsibility of serving our guests, how can I be afraid of hungry men?" Then everyone had one more bowl of duck tongue soup. At that point, the more conscientious guests could not continue to eat and put down their chopsticks. During this dinner, just because of a guest's casual comment, the lives of more than 3,000 ducks were wasted. Later, Cai Jing was demoted and exiled. So what happened to the extravagant Zhai Tian? All his family assets were confiscated by the government. He later became so poor that he had to beg for food in the streets and eventually died of starvation. This is another example of one dies when one has consumed all of one's destined good fortune. Although everyone's lifelong good fortune is different, each amount is fixed. An extravagant life will cause a few decades' worth of destined good fortune to be exhausted within only a few years. In other words, an extravagant life brings an early death. Therefore, you can see how an extravagant life can lead to disasters. This has been proven throughout history.
In the previous part, Professor Liu quoted the stories of Chang Me-je in the Ming Dynasty and Tai Jing and Zhai Chen in the Song Dynasty from historic classics to warn people that living an extravagant life is like slowly killing a frog by placing it in water and heating the water until it boils. As the frog becomes used to the increased water temperature and remains unaware of the danger it is in, it is boiled to death. Living extravagantly is the same. Doing so will unknowingly ruin our body, weaken our will, destroy our virtues, and consequently bring upon us disasters in this life. In more serious cases, the effect will even implicate future generations of the family and their descendants. Therefore, we should always stay highly vigilant against extravagance. In the next part, we will look at the extravagance practiced by people today and the profound social problems caused by this type of extravagance. Let us continue with the lectures on the governing principles of ancient China, the harm of extravagance.
In terms of extravagance, wealthy people today have gone even further than those in ancient times. As the economy has developed in many countries, many people have become wealthy. However, most wealthy people have not studied the teachings of the ancient sages. They do not know that the wealth coming from society should be contributed back to society, especially to those in need. Instead, wealthy people spend their money in extravagant and wasteful ways. They chase luxury clothes, cars, accessories, cosmetics and handbags. They do not even know where else they should spend the money. What is the consequence? The wealth of the family usually cannot last for more than 3 generations, and sometimes only 1 generation. Those of us who study the governing principles of ancient China can understand why some people continue to live a very simple life even after they have become rich or powerful. They donate money to good causes such as establishing schools and helping the poor. For example, the Chinese who went to Southeast Asia in the last century painstakingly established their careers. After making a lot of money and achieving success in business, their diligent and thrifty ways remained. At the same time, they were still generous towards their motherland's development, especially with building schools and financially helping kids from poor families go to school. They were not stingy at all. Why? Because they studied traditional Chinese culture and they knew that extravagance would not only bring disasters to themselves, but to their descendants as well. They also knew it would create social problems. What deep social problems will extravagance cause? The answer can be found in Mozi in the governing principles of ancient China. It says, if rich and powerful people are living an extravagant and luxurious life, while the solitary and miserable are suffering from cold and hunger, it is impossible for such a nation to avoid chaos. Therefore, if the ruler wants a peaceful and well-governed nation and hates to see it in disorder, the ruler must not indulge in excessive eating and drinking. Mozi continues to say, before knowing how to make boats and carts, primitive people could neither carry a heavy load nor travel a great distance. Thus, the sage kings made boats and carts to help the people. The boats and carts were made durable and convenient so that they would carry much and travel far. Such an undertaking takes little wealth but produces many benefits. Naturally, the people found it agreeable and convenient. The people were not tired and the ruler's needs were met. So the people loved and followed him. Today, when emperors make boats and carts, the situation is quite different. Having the boats and carts made durable and convenient, the emperors then required the people to decorate them. The carts are decorated with embroidery and boats with carving. Thus, women have to stop weaving cloth to do the embroidery, so the people are left with no cloth and are cold. Men have to abandon agriculture to do the carving, so the people become hungry. When the ruler builds such boats and carts for himself, his assistants naturally imitate him. Therefore, the people become victims of both hunger and cold. Under these circumstances, wickedness will arise and fraud will be committed. As crimes increase, the penalties become more severe. As a result, the country suffers from chaos. If a ruler wants a peaceful and well-governed nation and hates to see it in disorder, the ruler must not indulge himself in constructing excessively adorned boats and carts. Therefore, back to our original question, what deep social problem will be caused by the ruler's extravagance? The nation could fall into chaos. In current society, cars are increasingly luxurious. Air pollution is worsening and fuel resources are being depleted. But many people still appear to be endlessly pursuing a lifestyle of extravagance and waste. If the whole society advocates extravagance, what happens to the country? What happens to our resources? What happens to our environment? And what happens to our future? Another classic, Guanzi, provides further analysis. If a nation prevails in extravagance and waste, the national discretionary expenditure will be excessive. If the national discretionary expenditure is excessive, people will become poor. If ordinary citizens suffer from poverty, wickedness will arise. If wickedness arises, fraud will be committed. Therefore, why does wickedness arise? One reason is poverty. Why is fraud committed? One reason is because people want to enjoy extravagant and luxurious lifestyles like others do. Facing limited prospects of wealth through honest means, what can they do? Some will commit fraud. Therefore, Guanzi concludes, wickedness and fraud is the result of insufficient resources, and the cause of insufficient resources is extravagance. How to suppress the root cause of wickedness and fraud? The nation must start with advocating fiscal responsibility and fight against the practice of extravagance, corruption, and wastefulness. This is a matter for the whole nation and every family.
Extravagance will not only bring problems to individuals, but can also bring disaster to an entire country. If leaders practice extravagance rather than fiscal responsibility, and their subordinates imitate them, extravagance will become a common practice across the whole country. Then the country is likely to suffer misfortune and disasters. Through the records and comments in classic books such as the Mozi, compiled in the Governing Principles of Ancient China, and in Guanzi, Professor Liu told us that if a government does not spend money on its people, but instead extravagantly wastes it on the leaders' personal enjoyment, governmental offices and vanity projects, the excessive expenditures of the government will deprive average people of the things that are important for their futures, such as education and health. Because it is taxpayers who pay the bills of the government. If ordinary citizens suffer from poverty, then wickedness can arise. If wickedness arises, more fraud and theft might be committed. People will take matters into their own hands. If crimes become more common, the country will descend into chaos. Furthermore, an extravagant life may make people too comfortable to strive for progress. If extravagance prevails across the whole country and all citizens indulge in pleasure-seeking rather than making progress, the national power will be more likely to gradually diminish. Once national power decreases, other countries may take advantage and interfere with the domestic affairs. Consequently, internal disorder and external interference will work together and bring devastating trouble to the country. The harm of extravagance is so great. Therefore, how we suppress extravagance is a big concern for everyone. Let us continue with the lectures on the governing principles of ancient China, the harm of extravagance.
How do we extinguish the common practice of extravagance? The Book of Later Han, compiled in the Governing Principles of Ancient China, offers a solution. The influence of leaders on people of lower ranks is like strong wind to grass. It is well known that the direction of grass will always follow that of strong wind. This is the same for people with a low position as it is for those with a higher position. Therefore, we can see that if the leaders do not purge themselves of extravagance and advocate fiscal responsibility, people in lower positions will also be inclined to indulge their desires. For example, as we can see, government office buildings are becoming increasingly luxurious. What is the result of this extra spending? Ordinary citizens copy this practice and they build larger and larger homes and compare them with others. Your house has 2 stories, so I have to build a 3-story house to beat yours. Building designs are becoming increasingly luxurious and wasteful. In this way, the practice of comparing and competing starts to prevail, while the root cause is lack of wisdom and ignorance about the teaching of the sages. In ancient times, most rulers accepted sages' teachings and paid great attention to their own lifestyles to ensure that they would not have a bad influence on the country and the public. Let's look at a few examples. The records of the Grand Historian says, when King Yao was a ruler of ancient China, the roof of his palace was made of untrimmed thatched grass, and the oak-made rafters were not cut or carved. The house that he was living in was very plain and simple. Because King Yao, as the ruler, could purge himself from extravagance and advocate thrift and fiscal responsibility, the officials and people followed him and refrained from extravagance. In the end, King Yao achieved great governance with ease. In ancient China, not only rulers accepted sages' teachings, most officials did too. When seeing a ruler begin to be extravagant, they would offer advice to that ruler. For example, in the history book Spring and Autumn, compiled in the Governing Principles of Ancient China, the following story was recorded. King Ling of Chu extravagantly built a gazebo. One day he invited his official Wu Ju to stand on the gazebo. The king asked, "Have a look at this gazebo. Isn't it beautiful?" Wu Ju said, "I have heard that a king always regards respecting and obtaining virtuous officials as beauty, peace and harmony to people as pleasure, listening and following sages' teachings as smartness, and being able to attract residents from far away as wisdom. However, I have never heard a king refer to a high and grand building with delicate, colourful drawings and carvings as beauty." Wu Ju continued, "Previously, King Zhuan of Chu built a gazebo and called it Pao Ju. Its height was only enough for observing astronomical phenomena that could help predict good or bad luck, and its size was only just large enough to contain the utensils and the tableware of a banquet. The amount of timber used for construction did not affect the need to guard the city. The funds used did not come from any public funds treasury. When building this gazebo, the common people's farming was not affected, and officials did not need to be distracted from their usual schedule of attending the imperial court. Because King Zhuan of Chu had such virtue, he was able to put down a rebellion, conquer the enemy, and avoid being hated and disliked by the other kings and dukes. But now, Your Majesty, you have built this tall gazebo by exhausting the people, expending a large sum of public money, and causing a reduction in agriculture and burdening officials. It took quite a few years to complete this building. I don't know why you say it is beautiful. Regarding beauty, it should not harm anything or anyone. If something is beautiful just to look at, but is expensive and deprives people of time and resources while increasing the personal wealth of its owner by leaving people in poverty, how can we call it a thing of beauty? A leader of a nation, such as a king, queen, or president, has to live with his or her people. If the people are in poverty, how can the leaders stay rich? The former king built the gazebo only for the purpose of military-related lectures, as well as observing astronomical phenomena to predict luck. The building was deliberately not built on agriculture land, the construction was financially efficient, the building did not interfere with the daily tasks of officials, and the construction schedule did not interrupt the people's farming. Unfertile, hardened and untillable land was chosen as the location. The construction timbers used for the gazebo were what was left after the city's defences were strengthened. The officials only came to the site after their daily work was completed. The construction was done when farmers were not busy. The purpose of building this gazebo was to benefit the public without exhausting people and money. If you, Your Majesty, believe this building is correct just because it looks beautiful, our kingdom of Chu will be in danger. Hence, rooting out the whole society's common practice of extravagance cannot be fully achieved by only one or two people. It not only requires leaders to obey the rules and be good role models, it also requires the people in lower positions to learn and remind the leaders to obey the rules along with them.
Although extravagance is very harmful and pervasive, it is still possible to be eliminated. Through stories in the records of the Grand Historian, the Book of Latter Han, and the Spring and Autumn compiled in the Governing Principles of Ancient China, Professor Liu told us that superiors' acts are always imitated by subordinates. To extinguish extravagance, leaders acting as role models are essential, just as is said in the classics. The influence of leaders on people of lower ranks is like strong wind to grass. If our leaders can carry on the traditional values of diligence and thrift, ordinary citizens will do so as well. If diligence and thrift prevail across a country, a golden age of peace and prosperity will not be far away.
So why do we need to study the governing principles of ancient China? Because it can help people establish a common moral outlook and a correct concept of honour and disgrace. What on earth is honour, disgrace, beauty or ugliness? Will we look upon constructing luxurious and extravagant office buildings as honour, or will we look upon diligence and thrift as honour? After reading the governing principles of ancient China, all of us will reach the same conclusion. When we read the governing principles of ancient China, we find that it does not talk much about detailed policies, systems or methods. It talks about truth. If the truth is understood and consensus is achieved, people will know how to deal with policies, systems, methods and so on, regardless of when or where they live. That's all for today. Thank you, everyone.